The city of Chicago hummed with early morning energy. The sun had just begun its slow ascent over the skyline, casting long shadows across the narrow streets lined with diners, coffee shops, and hurried pedestrians. The scent of fresh coffee and sizzling bacon filled the crisp autumn air, mingling with the distant honk of car horns and the rhythmic clicking of heels against the pavement. It was the kind of morning that made the city feel alive, where every street corner held a story waiting to unfold. Nestled between two taller buildings, Benny's Diner stood as a relic of the past, its neon sign flickering intermittently, struggling to hold onto its former glory. The once thriving diner had seen better days, now barely managing to stay afloat. Inside, the aroma of hotcakes and eggs battled with the faint, lingering scent of grease that never quite left the old booths. The place had an air of nostalgia, from the cracked red leather seats to the jukebox in the corner that no one ever bothered to fix. Behind the counter, Sophie Carter, a 25-year-old waitress, moved with practiced efficiency. Her uniform, a black dress with a white apron, was slightly faded but neatly pressed, a silent testament to her pride in her work. With a notepad tucked into her apron pocket and a warm, easygoing smile, she greeted each customer as though they were old friends. Sophie had worked at Benny's Diner for nearly 3 years, and in that time, she had come to know most of the regulars. She remembered their orders, their preferences, and even the small details they shared about their lives. She was the type of person who genuinely cared, the kind of waitress who didn't just take your order but also asked how your sick mother was doing or if your kid's soccer game went well. But beneath that gentle demeanor, Sophie carried her own burdens. The past year had been especially tough. Her mother had fallen ill, and the medical bills kept piling up. No matter how many extra shifts she picked up, her paycheck barely covered the rent, let alone the expensive treatments her mother needed. Some nights, she barely slept, lying awake wondering how she was going to make ends meet. But she never let her worries show, always greeting customers with the same warmth and kindness. To Sophie, helping others had always come naturally. She was the kind of person who would cover a coworker's shift without hesitation, leave a bigger tip for a struggling busker, or stop to help an elderly woman carry her groceries. It wasn't that she expected anything in return, it was simply who she was. That morning, as the first customers trickled in, Sophie pushed aside her exhaustion and focused on her work. She moved between tables, refilling coffee cups, taking orders, and offering bright smiles. The rhythmic clatter of plates, the hum of conversation, and the occasional laughter of customers made her forget, if only for a little while, about the weight she carried. Little did she know that this seemingly ordinary morning would change everything. The morning rush had come and gone, leaving Benny's Diner in a lull of quiet clinking dishes and the occasional murmur of conversation. Sophie Carter wiped her forehead with the back of her hand, exhaling as she stacked empty plates onto a tray. She glanced at the clock hanging above the coffee machine, 10:45 a.m. Still a long way to go before her shift ended. She grabbed a rag and moved toward the large glass windows at the front of the diner, wiping away streaks left by the morning condensation. That's when something outside caught her eye. Near the alleyway beside the diner, a small shape huddled against the base of the dumpster. At first, she thought it was just a pile of discarded rags or maybe an old trash bag. But when it shifted slightly, her breath caught in her throat. It was a puppy, tiny, frail, and shivering. Its fur, once golden, was now matted with dirt, and its ribs protruded through its thin coat. The little creature curled in on itself as though trying to disappear into the concrete. Sophie's heart twisted in her chest. Chicago was no place for a stray, especially not one this young. Winters could be brutal, and a dog like this wouldn't last long out in the cold. She bit her lip, glancing back toward the kitchen. Mr. Benny wouldn't approve of her stepping out, but she couldn't just walk away either. Her decision was made in an instant. Moving quickly, she grabbed a small bowl from the counter and ladled in some of the leftover chicken soup from the morning rush. Then, she tore a piece of bread in half and carefully arranged it beside the soup. Stealing a quick glance toward the front booth, where Mr. Benny was absorbed in his newspaper, Sophie took a deep breath and pushed through the back door. The moment she stepped into the cool alleyway, the smell of damp concrete and discarded food filled her nose. The puppy, sensing movement, shrank back, ears flattening against its head. Its eyes, wide, dark, and fearful, locked onto her, uncertain whether she was a threat. Sophie crouched low, careful not to startle it. Slowly, she slid the bowl closer. "It's okay, buddy," she whispered, her voice soft, soothing. "I won't hurt you." The puppy sniffed at the air, its tiny body trembling. It hesitated for a moment before cautiously inching forward, the scent of warm broth overpowering its fear. Sophie held her breath as it took a small, tentative lap at the soup. Relief flooded through her. She noticed something then, a frayed rope around its neck, the ends torn and jagged. This wasn't just a stray. Someone had abandoned it. A wave of sadness and anger washed over her. "Who could do something like this?" she murmured, her fingers tightening around the edge of her apron. She couldn't stay out here long, Mr. Benny would notice. But she couldn't just leave it here either. "I'll check on you again soon, little one," she promised, standing up. She had no idea that this small act of kindness would set off a chain of events that would change her life forever. Sophie hurried back inside the diner, her pulse quickening as she carefully placed the empty bowl into the sink. Her fingers trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the anger and sadness still swirling inside her. She couldn't shake the image of that tiny, shivering puppy, its bones visible beneath the dirt-matted fur. She quickly wiped her hands on her apron and turned toward the coffee station, forcing herself to focus on work. But as she reached for the pot, a loud, sharp voice cut through the air. "Sophie!" Her stomach clenched. She turned slowly to see Benny Roberts, the owner of the diner, standing in the doorway of the kitchen. His broad frame nearly filled the entrance, his arms crossed over his chest. His face, already permanently set in a scowl, looked even darker than usual. Sophie swallowed hard. "Why yes, Mr. Benny?" she asked, keeping her voice even. Benny stepped forward, his heavy boots thudding against the tiled floor. The entire diner seemed to fall silent, the few remaining customers sensing the tension in the air. Even Mark, her co-worker, froze mid-step near the register. "You want to tell me," Benny said, his voice low and dangerous, "why the hell you were outside feeding a goddamn stray?" Sophie flinched at the harshness in his tone, but she refused to look away. I just gave it some leftovers," she said carefully. "It was starving, Mr. Benny. Just a little soup." Benny's hand slammed against the counter, making a few empty coffee cups rattle. "This is a business, Carter, not a damn charity," he barked. "You think I can afford to have my food, being thrown away on some filthy mutt?" Sophie clenched her fists, her body stiffening with anger. "It was going to be thrown out anyway," she argued, her voice steady despite the fire building in her chest. "I didn't take anything fresh. It was just soup and bread that we weren't going to serve." Benny snorted, shaking his head. "Doesn't matter. You think kindness pays the rent? You think that damn dog is gonna come in here and buy a meal next time?" Mark, still standing near the register, shifted uncomfortably. He opened his mouth, hesitated, then glanced at Sophie apologetically. "Come on, Benny," he muttered. "It was just a little food." Benny snapped his glare toward him. "Oh, so now you want to run the place, huh? You want to start making the rules?" He stepped closer to Sophie, lowering his voice to an intimidating growl. "Listen to me, Carter. You want to act like a bleeding heart idiot? Go do it somewhere else. Not on my dime." Sophie felt heat rising to her face, but she forced herself to stay calm. "I wasn't trying to disrespect you," she said, keeping her voice as even as possible, though she could feel her hands trembling at her sides. "I just couldn't ignore it. That puppy was freezing, starving. It looked like someone abandoned it. I couldn't just walk past it and do nothing." Benny's expression darkened even further. "That's the problem with people like you," he sneered. "Always thinking with your damn heart instead of your head." He leaned in slightly, his voice dropping low enough that only Sophie could hear. You know what happens to people like that, Carter? They get used. They get walked all over. Sophie's jaw tightened. That's not true, she whispered. Benny straightened, chuckling bitterly. Oh, sure it is. The world doesn't give a damn about your kindness. And neither do I. He turned away, waving a dismissive hand. Consider this your warning, he said, his tone dripping with finality. You ever waste my food again, on a dog, on a bum, on anyone who ain't a paying customer, you're done. A tense silence stretched between them. Sophie knew she could apologize, pretend she had learned her lesson, and move on. But something inside her refused to back down. She lifted her chin. I'd do it again, she said quietly. Benny froze mid-step. Slowly, he turned back to her, his face dark with fury. What did you just say? Sophie stood taller, ignoring the way her heart pounded painfully against her ribs. I said I'd do it again, she repeated, louder this time. Because that dog didn't deserve to be left out there. And if I had to choose between working here and helping something that can't help itself, she lifted her apron, untying it with steady hands. Then I don't want to work here. The entire diner went deathly silent. Even Mark's eyes widened in shock. Benny stared at her, his face unreadable for a moment. Then, he laughed. A cold, sharp laugh, full of ridicule and amusement. You're serious, he said, shaking his head. You're really gonna throw away your damn job, your paycheck, over a stray dog? Sophie took a deep breath, feeling lighter than she had in weeks. Yes, she said simply. Benny's smirk faded. Well, don't expect me to take you back when you come crawling, he snapped. You're making the biggest mistake of your life, Carter. Sophie folded her apron neatly and placed it on the counter. No, she said softly. I don't think I am. With that, she turned on her heel and walked out of Benny's diner. She didn't look back. Outside, the autumn wind was crisp against her skin, but for the first time in a long time, she felt warm inside. The tiny puppy was still curled up by the dumpster, looking up as she approached. Sophie knelt beside it, brushing her fingers gently over its fur. Guess it's just you and me now, huh? She murmured, smiling despite herself. She had no idea that in just 30 minutes, her entire life was about to change. The wind howled softly through the alleyway, sending a light shiver down Sophie's spine. She pulled her thin cardigan closer around her, though it did little to block out the crisp autumn air. The puppy at her feet whimpered, shifting slightly in the shadows near the dumpster. It still looked frightened, but at least it had eaten something. Sophie ran a gentle hand down its bony back, murmuring softly. It's okay, little guy. We'll figure something out. Her voice was calm, reassuring, but deep down, she had no idea what she was going to do next. She had just quit her job. No backup plan. No savings. Rent was due in 2 weeks, and her mother's hospital bills weren't going to disappear. A small wave of panic pressed at her chest, but she forced herself to stay composed. She'd made the right choice. Just as she was trying to gather her thoughts, the sound of a car door slamming shut broke through the silence. Sophie's head snapped up. A sleek black luxury sedan was parked near the front of the diner, a car that absolutely did not belong in this part of town. The polished exterior gleamed under the morning sun, reflecting the surrounding buildings like dark glass. Then, from the driver's side, a man stepped out. Sophie's brows furrowed as she watched him. He was tall, maybe in his mid-50s, with a sharp, well-groomed appearance that screamed old money. His dark gray coat hung neatly over his broad shoulders, and his polished black shoes made no sound as he moved across the pavement with effortless grace. This was not someone who stumbled into Benny's diner for a casual cup of coffee. Who was he? And why was he here? Sophie instinctively stepped in front of the puppy, shielding it slightly, as the man approached with measured steps. He stopped a few feet away, his piercing blue-gray eyes scanning her with quiet intensity. Miss Carter, I presume? His voice was calm, smooth, with an air of authority. Sophie blinked in surprise. Yes? He gave a slow nod, then glanced down toward the small, trembling puppy at her feet. His lips pressed together slightly, as if confirming something to himself. For a long moment, he said nothing, simply observing. Sophie shifted uncomfortably under his gaze. Can I help you with something? A hint of amusement flickered across his expression. Actually, I believe it's the other way around. She frowned. I don't understand. The man let out a slow breath, glancing toward the diner behind them before returning his gaze to her. I was sitting across the street earlier, he said. I saw what happened. Sophie felt her stomach twist. He had seen everything? Benny yelling at her. Her quitting. The entire humiliating spectacle? Heat crept into her cheeks. Oh, that. The man tilted his head slightly, watching her reaction. Yes. That. She forced an awkward laugh. Well, I guess I really made a scene, huh? He didn't laugh. Instead, he simply said, You did the right thing. Sophie's breath caught. She hadn't expected that. Most people, especially someone as well-dressed and important-looking as this man, would have sided with Benny, calling her foolish for throwing away her job over a stray dog. But this stranger, he wasn't looking at her with pity. Or judgment. Just understanding. Sophie swallowed hard. I don't regret it, she admitted, glancing down at the puppy. I couldn't walk away. The man studied her for another moment, then nodded slightly, as if that was exactly what he had expected her to say. Then, finally, he extended his hand. My name is Jonathan Hayes. Sophie's heart nearly stopped. Jonathan Hayes? The Jonathan Hayes? The billionaire restaurateur? The man behind Hayes Hospitality Group, one of the biggest luxury restaurant empires in the country? She hesitated before shaking his hand, still stunned. I know who you are. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. Then this will make things easier. Sophie blinked. I don't understand. Jonathan glanced down at the puppy, then back at her. I was already looking for you, he said simply. But I just didn't know it yet. Sophie stared at Jonathan Hayes, trying to process his words. Already looking for me? That didn't make sense. She crossed her arms, suddenly wary. I don't understand, why would someone like you be looking for me? Jonathan's gaze flickered to the puppy at her feet, then back to her. Because of him. Sophie's breath hitched. She looked down at the tiny, shivering dog, confusion swirling in her chest. The puppy? Jonathan nodded. His name is Leo. Her eyes widened. You know this dog? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jonathan exhaled slowly, his jaw tightening slightly, as if remembering something painful. Yes, he said. Because he's mine. Sophie froze. For a long moment, all she could do was stare at him, trying to make sense of what he had just said. His? She glanced down at the pitiful-looking puppy, its matted fur, its thin body curled up against the cold pavement. This was a billionaire's dog? That can't be right, she murmured, her mind racing. This puppy was abandoned. He had a torn rope around his neck. He's been starving. How could he be yours? Jonathan's expression darkened. Because he was stolen from me. Sophie sucked in a breath. Jonathan's voice was calm, but there was an undercurrent of something deeper, anger, grief, regret. 2 nights ago, he continued, Leo was taken from my property by someone I trusted. A personal assistant. I thought he had gone missing, until I started searching the streets. His lips pressed together. I had no idea he had ended up here, alone, abandoned. Sophie felt a surge of anger on Leo's behalf. Someone just dumped him, she asked, her voice sharp with disbelief. Jonathan gave a slow nod. That's what it looks like. He sighed, rubbing his temple. I was following leads, trying to track him down, and then, this morning, I happened to be across the street. His eyes locked onto hers. I watched everything, Sophie, he said. I saw you kneel down, offer him food, comfort him. I saw you stand up to that man inside that diner. Sophie swallowed hard, realizing just how much he had witnessed. Jonathan's voice was softer now. You didn't know who he belonged to. You didn't have any reason to care. And yet, you did. He took a step closer. That, he said, his tone unwavering, is why I'm here. Sophie felt a lump form in her throat. Jonathan Hayes, one of the most powerful men in the restaurant industry, had seen her lowest moment. And instead of pitying her, instead of looking down on her, he saw something worth noticing. She had no idea what that meant. But she was about to find out. Sophie felt like the world had tilted beneath her feet. Jonathan Hayes, one of the most influential restaurateurs in the country, had just told her that he had been looking for her. That he had seen everything. That he wasn't here by coincidence. And most shocking of all, that the tiny, helpless puppy she had just saved belonged to him. She rubbed her arms, feeling the autumn wind nip at her skin. So, what now? She asked cautiously. You came here to find your dog. You found him. What does that have to do with me? Jonathan's lips curved into something between a smile and a knowing smirk. I didn't just find Leo, Sophie, he said. I found you. She blinked. Me? He nodded. You're exactly the kind of person I need working for me. Sophie stared at him, completely thrown off. What? Jonathan's voice was calm, measured, and absolute. I own a high-end restaurant chain. One of my locations here in Chicago is in need of a new floor manager. He met her eyes. And I want to offer you the job. Silence. Sophie actually felt her brain short-circuit for a second. She let out a disbelieving laugh, running a hand through her hair. Wait, hold on. You just met me. You watched me get fired. And now you want me to manage one of your restaurants? Jonathan's expression didn't waver. Yes. Sophie let out another stunned laugh, shaking her head. That's insane. You don't even know if I'm qualified. Jonathan arched an eyebrow. I know exactly what I need to know. Sophie folded her arms, still trying to wrap her head around this conversation. And what's that? Jonathan's blue-gray eyes held steady on hers. That you care about people. That stopped her cold. Jonathan continued, a restaurant doesn't succeed just because of good food, Sophie. It succeeds because of people. The way they're treated. The atmosphere that's created. I need someone who understands that. And you do. Sophie bit her lip, heart pounding. This man was serious. He had seen her at her absolute lowest, and instead of seeing someone weak, he saw someone worthy of opportunity. But why me? She whispered. Jonathan smiled slightly. Because people like you, people who act with kindness, even when it costs them, are the kind of people I trust. Sophie felt her throat tighten. For so long, she had believed that her compassion, her softness, was a weakness. That people like Benny were right, and the world would always punish her for it. But now? A man like Jonathan Hayes, a man who had built an empire, was telling her that kindness wasn't a weakness. It was an asset. And for the first time, she believed it. She took a deep breath and met his gaze. What's the catch? She asked. Jonathan chuckled. No catch. Just an opportunity. Take it or leave it. Sophie grinned. When do I start? Sophie had never set foot in a restaurant this luxurious before. The moment she walked into Hayes' Brasserie, the difference between Benny's diner and this place felt like night and day. The scent of freshly baked bread and slow-roasted meats filled the air, mingling with the crisp notes of white wine being poured at nearby tables. The dining room was sleek and elegant, with golden chandeliers casting a soft glow over polished mahogany tables. Every detail, from the hand-folded linen napkins to the delicate floral centerpieces, exuded class and precision. And now, she was in charge of it. A nervous flutter ran through her stomach as she stood near the front podium, dressed in a crisp white blouse and fitted black slacks, a far cry from the simple apron and dress she'd worn at Benny's. Jonathan had arranged for everything, from her new uniform to a personal introduction to the staff. Speaking of which, a woman in her early 30s approached, her dark eyes sharp yet professional. She wore an elegant black blazer, her auburn hair tied into a sleek ponytail. "You must be Sophie," the woman said, extending a perfectly manicured hand. "I'm Charlotte Mercer, the assistant manager." Sophie shook her hand firmly, hoping her palms weren't as sweaty as they felt. "Nice to meet you. I guess this is my first day." Charlotte's lips curved slightly, but her gaze remained assessing. "Jonathan doesn't just hire people on a whim. If he chose you, you must have something special." Sophie wasn't sure about that, but she simply nodded. "I'll do my best." Charlotte studied her for a beat, then handed her a tablet displaying tonight's reservations. "You'll be overseeing service today. That means coordinating with the chefs, handling any VIP guests, and making sure the staff is on top of things." Sophie tried not to let the weight of responsibility crush her. Just 2 days ago, she had been serving greasy eggs and coffee to truck drivers. Now, she was managing an entire fine dining establishment. Taking a steady breath, she straightened her posture. Got it. The next few hours were a blur. She met the kitchen staff, each chef moving with military-like precision. She learned how orders were expedited, how VIP tables required special attention, and how even the smallest mistake, a lukewarm appetizer, a misplaced wine pairing, could ruin a guest's experience. But as overwhelming as it was, something strange happened. Sophie adjusted quickly. She anticipated issues before they arose, kept the waitstaff calm under pressure, and made sure the guests felt valued. It was different from the diner, sure. But at the end of the day, people were people. And she knew how to take care of people. As the night ended, Charlotte approached her with a small nod of approval. "Not bad for your first day, Carter." Sophie smiled, exhausted but proud. For the first time in a long time, she felt like she belonged. The weeks flew by, and Sophie quickly adapted to her new role at Hayes Brasserie. What had once seemed intimidating now felt natural, coordinating staff, ensuring guests had an unforgettable experience, and handling unexpected issues with a level head. Jonathan Hayes had been right. She belonged here. But as much as she loved her job, there was one thought that never left her mind: Leo, the abandoned puppy she had saved. Since that day outside Benny's diner, Leo had been living with her, slowly recovering from the trauma of being abandoned. His once thin and fragile frame had filled out, and his matted fur had grown soft and golden again. But Sophie couldn't help but think about how many other animals weren't as lucky. She had always been compassionate, but something about that moment, about choosing to help despite the cost, had changed her. She wanted to do more. One night, after closing the restaurant, she approached Jonathan in his office. "Can I talk to you about something?" she asked, stepping inside. Jonathan looked up from his laptop, setting his glasses aside. "Of course." Sophie hesitated, trying to gather her thoughts. She had no idea if he would go for this. "I want to start a program," she said finally. "Something where we donate our leftover food to animal shelters instead of throwing it away." Jonathan's eyebrows lifted slightly. "Interesting," he mused. "Go on." Sophie exhaled, relieved he was actually listening. "I know high-end restaurants have strict standards," she continued. "Any food that isn't perfect gets tossed, even if it's still good. But shelters are full of hungry, abandoned animals, and they're always short on resources." Jonathan leaned back in his chair, considering. You want to connect our restaurant chain with local shelters? Yes, she said eagerly. Not just this restaurant, all of them. If we could arrange regular donations, we'd be making a real impact. Jonathan studied her for a long moment before a small smile touched his lips. You really care about this, don't you? Sophie nodded without hesitation. I do. I know what it's like to feel abandoned, to feel like no one cares. Animals don't get a say in what happens to them. It's up to us to do the right thing. Jonathan let out a quiet chuckle. That's exactly why I hired you, Sophie. She blinked. Wait, does that mean you'll approve it? Jonathan grinned. Consider it done. Sophie's heart soared. Within a week, Sophie had worked with the restaurant suppliers and local shelters to launch the program. Every night, rather than discarding high-quality leftovers, staff would pack meals for nearby shelters. But Sophie wasn't done yet. Inspired by Leo's story, she also began volunteering at a rescue center on her days off. She helped clean kennels, walked nervous dogs who had been abandoned like Leo, and even started using her new salary to help pay for medical treatments for sick animals. For the first time in her life, Sophie felt like she was making a real difference. And it all started with one small act of kindness. Benny's diner wasn't the same after Sophie left. At first, Benny had brushed it off, convinced that losing one waitress wouldn't hurt his business. He had seen plenty of employees come and go, why would this time be any different? But this time was different. Without Sophie, the diner lost its warmth. Customers noticed the change immediately, orders were slow, service was rushed, and the friendly atmosphere Sophie had helped create was gone. Then came the bad press. Word had spread about what had happened that day, how Benny had fired an employee just for feeding a starving puppy. The internet didn't take kindly to it. A local food blogger caught wind of the story and published an article titled, "The Heartless Owner of Benny's Diner, Where Kindness Gets You Fired." The article went viral. The diner's online reviews plummeted, with people calling Benny a cruel, greedy boss. Some customers boycotted the diner completely, while others showed up just to confront him about his behavior. "Would you have fired me if I fed a stray child?" one woman had snapped at him. Benny's temper only made things worse. He yelled at customers, barked orders at employees, and refused to acknowledge his mistake. But the more he fought back, the worse things got. Then came the final blow. One afternoon, Benny stepped outside to take a smoke break, only to see a black luxury sedan pull up to the curb. Jonathan Hayes stepped out. Benny's stomach twisted. He had heard rumors that Sophie was working for the billionaire restaurateur, but why was Hayes here? The answer came seconds later. Jonathan strolled up to him, hands in his pockets, and smirked. "I see business isn't going so well, Benny," he said casually. Benny's jaw clenched. "What do you want?" Jonathan's smile didn't fade. "Just thought I'd drop by and let you know something interesting." He paused. "I just bought this property." Benny's face drained of color. "What?" he sputtered. "That's not possible." "It is," Jonathan said, unbothered. "Your landlord was more than happy to sell. With your bad reputation, he figured it was only a matter of time before you went under." Benny stared at him, speechless. "You have a month to pack up and leave," Jonathan continued. "After that, I'll be turning this place into something worthwhile." He smiled. "Maybe a cafe that donates a portion of its profits to animal shelters." Sound familiar? Benny felt his entire world collapse. As Jonathan turned to leave, he glanced back one last time. "Funny how life works, isn't it?" he mused. "Kindness has a way of coming back around." And with that, Benny's downfall was complete. Sophie stood outside the newly renovated Hayes and Paws Cafe, the morning sun casting a warm glow over the storefront. The place had once been Benny's diner, a symbol of greed and heartlessness. Now, it was something entirely different, a place filled with kindness, warmth, and second chances. She stepped inside, inhaling the scent of freshly brewed coffee and warm pastries. The cafe was already buzzing with customers, people chatting over breakfast, a group of volunteers discussing upcoming adoption events, and in the corner, a small play area for rescued dogs. Sophie smiled. Everything had come full circle. Leo, now healthy and full of life, trotted beside her, his tail wagging happily. He had been the start of everything, the tiny spark that had changed her life in ways she never could have imagined. As she made her way to the counter, she spotted Jonathan Hayes sitting by the window, sipping his usual black coffee. "Settling in well?" he asked, setting his cup down with a knowing smirk. Sophie chuckled, sliding into the seat across from him. "You could say that." She still couldn't believe it sometimes, how much had changed in just a few short months. From a struggling waitress at a dead-end diner to the manager of a restaurant that actually made a difference. Not just any restaurant, but one that donated meals to animal shelters, hosted adoption events, and supported local rescues. It was more than she ever could have hoped for. Jonathan studied her for a moment, then nodded approvingly. "You deserve this, Sophie." She felt a lump in her throat. No one had ever told her that before. "Thank you," she whispered. Just then, a familiar voice called out from the entrance. "Sophie." She turned to see Mark, her old co-worker from Benny's, grinning as he walked in. "You actually did it," he said, looking around in awe. "You turned this place into something amazing." Sophie grinned. "Told you I would." Mark chuckled. "Think you've got room for one more?" She pretended to consider it. Depends. How do you feel about serving lattes with a side of puppy cuddles?" He laughed. "Sounds like the best job ever." Sophie's heart swelled. She had fought for this. She had lost everything, only to gain something even greater. And as she looked around at her new life, at the rescued dogs playing in the cafe, the smiling customers, and the warmth that filled the air, she knew, without a doubt, that this was exactly where she was meant to be. Later that evening, as the cafe wound down for the night, Sophie stood by the front window, gazing out at the quiet street. The neon sign of Hayes and Paws Cafe cast a warm glow over the sidewalk, a beacon of kindness and second chances. She sighed, but it was the kind of sigh that came from contentment, not exhaustion. Leo sat at her feet, his golden fur gleaming under the soft cafe lights. He nudged her hand, and she smiled, reaching down to scratch behind his ears. "We did good, didn't we, buddy?" The puppy licked her fingers in response, as if agreeing. As she turned, she saw the wall near the counter, a new addition that made her chest tighten every time she looked at it. A bulletin board, filled with before and after photos of rescued animals. Some had come from shelters, some had been found wandering the streets, but every single one had been given a second chance. She reached out and ran her fingers over one particular picture, a tiny, frail puppy curled up beside a dumpster. Right next to it, another photo showed the same dog, now strong and happy, sitting beside her. Leo's transformation. Her transformation. A soft voice interrupted her thoughts. "Proud of yourself yet?" She turned to see Jonathan, leaning against the counter with his arms crossed, watching her with a small smile. Sophie let out a breathless laugh. "I don't think it's hit me yet." Jonathan chuckled. "It will." He glanced at the bulletin board. "You've started something real here, Sophie. This place, it's more than just a cafe. It's a home for people who care. A place where small kindnesses make a big difference." She felt a lump form in her throat. I never thought any of this would be possible." Jonathan's eyes softened. "That's the thing about kindness," he said. "It has a way of coming back to you when you least expect it." Sophie nodded, swallowing the emotion rising in her chest. Just then, the door swung open, and a young girl holding a tiny stray kitten stepped inside, her eyes wide with hope. "Excuse me," the girl said, her voice small. "I found him all alone. I didn't know where else to go." Sophie smiled. You came to the right place. She knelt and gently stroked the kitten's head. It reminded her of Leo, of how one simple moment had changed everything. As she stood, she glanced at Jonathan, who gave her a knowing nod. And just like that, she knew, this was only the beginning. The cafe, the rescues, the second chances. It was all just getting started. And Sophie Carter had finally found her purpose.